Hello, my name's Josie Toplin. I'm Assistant Curate at Woodchurch on the Wirral, and today I'm reflecting on the Gospel reading for the third Sunday of Easter. You can find it in Luke chapter 24, beginning at verse 13, and it's the story of two travellers on the road to Emmaus. The story begins on the first Easter day as the day draws to a close, and two travellers set off from Jerusalem to go to Emmaus. On the way they meet with a stranger and have a conversation with him, eventually stopping off to spend the night and to eat together with the stranger. The turning point in the story, the point at which everything changes, is when the stranger takes the bread on the table at the meal, breaks it and shares it out among them, and in that moment, in the breaking of the bread, they recognize that the stranger is Jesus. That's a beautiful moment in a beautiful story. But at a time like this, when we're not able to break bread together, I thought it might be more useful for us to think about those parts of the story where Jesus is present, but they don't recognize him, rather than focusing on the one moment when they do. As Christians, we're familiar with the idea that we meet the living Christ in the Scriptures. And that's one of the things we're reminded of in the Emmaus story. As the two travellers walk along, discussing the shock of Jesus' death and their confusion at the women's story of an empty tomb, Jesus draws alongside them and opens the Scriptures to them, showing them how the Old Testament writers foresaw the Messiah's death and rising in glory, and helping them to see this as a part of God's plan for the rescue of the world. And we're reminded that Jesus will draw alongside us too, even in the lockdown, when we prayerfully open our Bibles to look for him. Another way in which we expect to find Christ is in those who lack companionship, food and shelter. He told us, didn't he, that whenever we do something to meet another person's needs, it's him we're meeting and him we're helping. We're reminded of that too in the story. When it's dropping dark and the two friends who have somewhere to stay realize that Jesus doesn't and is planning to travel on through the night, they ask him to stay with them. Without that offer of hospitality and care, there would be no meal, would there? And without the meal, there would be no moment of recognition. Maybe for us too, our moment of recognition will come in serving our neighbour, albeit these days at a distance. All this, seeking Jesus in Scripture and in loving service, is familiar to us as Christians. But there are other circumstances in the story when Christ draws near to the two travellers, which it might be helpful for us to be reminded of. I'm thinking of the way that in the story, the travellers encounter the risen Christ not when they're sailing smoothly through life being good disciples, but precisely when they're not. It's when they're thrown into confusion and doubt by the events of Good Friday. It's when they're too low to be elated by the women's report of an empty tomb and just feel puzzled and afraid instead. It's when they're almost certainly frightened and running away from Jerusalem and the threat of arrest themselves. It's then that Jesus draws alongside. And that's good news for you and me too, isn't it? That though we might not see it, he comes to you and me too in our weakness, our doubts, our pain and failure. And one last thing. I've been really struck reading this familiar story again by something it might have taken lockdown for me to realise. In the end, Jesus is revealed to them only when they've stopped. When the hurrying and worrying give way to resting, to quiet and to caring for their own needs, that's when they recognise him.